So, welcome back. This is the podcast for the Forum on Religion and Ecology, and it's called Spotlights because each week we try and spotlight somebody working in or around the field of religion and ecology. And this week, I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Tyler Tully. Tyler, welcome.
Hey, Sam. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure. You do really cool work in the field. You're a doctoral candidate in religious studies
Mhm.
and the Arthur Peacocke Graduate Scholar in Science and Religion at the University of Oxford, which I think some people have heard of. It's an
Right.
up and coming university. So I'd love to hear some of the stuff you do because you're working at an interesting intersection between a lot of exciting fields of study that are really important ecologically, in terms of religion, in terms of politics. So I wonder if you could start maybe by saying what your dissertation is about.
Oh, thanks. Well, thanks again for having me on the show. For has interestingly enough been a part of like my trajectory in this direction, and so I'm looking forward to talking about that as the conversation unfolds. And thanks again for having me on board. And for the kind words. So where to begin? One's dissertation. I mean, I'm sure you remember what that's like when you're in the throes of writing up, trying to articulate the elevator speech, as it were, is always like at the forefront of our
Exactly.
minds,
Yeah.
right? And to-do lists. Well, my dissertation is called Critical Materialisms, Power, Place, and Personhood in White and Black Red Spaces. Um, how did I come into this dissertation? Through the back door, sideways, and passed out. I I am such a product of communities and relationships and events, like so many other people, that it's difficult to pin it down to one thing. But there's a couple of different waypoints that stand out for me. Um, One, I did my master's degree at Chicago Theological Seminary, and in my second year of study there, I had the great pleasure of working with Ken Stone, who's a professor in the Hebrew Bible, but he's also a prolific writer in animal studies and religion. And he was in the process of writing what became a fantastic book called Animals in the Hebrew Bible by Kim
Right.
Stone. Um, and so he was working out all these different ideas um, through our seminar. And I always loved taking classes with professors on topics that they're passionate about, because that always translates in affect, right? And I tend to learn more through that experience and interchange. Um, so it's contagious for me, right? And it was so for Ken. Ken is like very passionate about this and inquisitive, and that just rubbed off on all of us. We were asking questions we had never asked before. We were introduced to some difficult concepts about um, our liberal humanist tradition that we've inherited, and largely, I would argue, left unquestioned and untheorized in critical ways by and large. So I very much appreciated that as a waypoint on this journey. It opened up my, um, experience to conversations in post-humanism, and conversations around the new cosmologies, and conversations around critical animal studies, uh, overlaps and intersections with race and othering, and our classification systems in our knowledge production. Um, the more that we peeled back some of these layers in this seminar, the more interconnected all of this seemed to be for me. And like any good class, it made me want to go deeper, right? And to try to figure out more. Um, and then, of course, another part of this is also interest in critical theory. In critical theory, I think, is best done when it is self-reflexive and punches up,
Hmm.
right? Like that's the whole point, is
Right.
to hold power accountable um, from a certain positionality from within the academy. And this is a very privileged position in many cases, in most cases, right? This is multiple layers of gender and racial and abled and embodied privilege that comes together, sometimes with class, sometimes not with class, in the academy. But how do we speak from that position, um, of so much power and privilege to hold privilege and power accountable. And what does that look like? And so for me, I started looking at ways in drawing inspiration from friends and community members that were actively engaged in other processes of knowledge production that were not involved in the academy, right? And this materializes in many different ways and in many different communities. And that's probably what's so powerful about it, is that it's based and it's always particular to location. And one of these longstanding phenomenon are anti-colonial, which is to say traditional practices of knowledge that occur in native communities in what is now the United States. And um, having grown up in Oklahoma, having been descended from both settler dirt farmers that were involved in the land runs there, and also from you descended from some of the 5 civilized tribes there, the Chickasaw Nation and Muskogee Creek Nation um, of Indian Territory, which later became subsumed into the modern state of Oklahoma. Um, I had grown up in a place where extractive oil economies ran the state, and where the tribes were constantly in a hegemonic relationship with the state, where on the one hand they had to work within the existing infrastructures, but they were always outside of it, right? They weren't allowed in. Um, and so drawing upon those experiences in those communities that I come from, I started to look at these larger questions of power in a different way. And this has been a long-standing, lifelong process, right? I didn't have like one moment of epiphany, but um, I'm constantly challenged by that interchange and those different types of tensions that develop from where we come from and where we're going, and how do we affect change for the positive from our positionality.
Nice. Yeah, I really appreciate that about your work in general. You know, you're dealing with these like very serious issues of like high theory, but it's very grounded in your experience, your own communities, the traditions that you kind of intersect with in one way or another. And to me, that's really what scholarship is at its best. It has to be about that, right? Otherwise, it's just kind of spinning our wheels and whatnot.
Right, right, right.
And obviously, recently in the United States, critical race theory has kind of become a term I think a lot of people have heard, and maybe
Mm,
they hadn't heard it before. And it's this kind of bogeyman of like the Trump administration.
mm.
And so I'm curious if you could say a little bit more for people who might do a lot of work with religion, ecology, these kind of things, but might not really know beyond like bumper sticker definitions or something.
Mm.
What exactly is critical race theory, or how critical theory applies to race and racism?
It's an excellent question, and what a big responsibility to try to answer that. Let me try.
Yeah,
And this
so
is this
sorry in
no,
advance.
because I think this is absolutely relevant to the study of religion, and also any study of ecology, environmental humanities, whether that's in the hard sciences or not. Um, I'm in a really interesting position with one ear in the Anglophone like academy and the other in the United States. And I don't consider myself a transatlanticist by any means. Just this poor kid that grew up from Oklahoma. But I am like, just on Twitter, for example, like I see these different overlapping and simultaneous conversations that are happening amongst friends in the UK, and then also friends here in the United States. And this villainization of critical race theory is happening at the same time in both locations. And it's fascinating to watch it happen in real time, in different ways and with different rhetorics, but always in the same interests of power. And this is what critical theory tries to do. It tries to look at the rhetorics that are being incorporated in the interests of power, right? It doesn't assume that knowledge is only neutral, and that knowledge doesn't have a politics of its own, and that it doesn't have a power socially to affect different ends, right? So when we look at critical race theory and the way that it's developing as a discourse, a divisive discourse, um, on the right in both the United States and in the UK, this is ascending at the exact same time as Brexit, and the exact same time as the Trump administration, and all the special interests that they account to, and that they account for. So what critical, I was so privileged to study critical race theory um, through the work of Derek Bell first, and then later through Kimberly Crenshaw and others. Um, I grew up in Oklahoma in an evangelical Christian school where my mom taught. And because she taught there, we received a great scholarship to attend. And this school was obsessed with the westward chain of history as it expanded with civilization moving west. And that education gave me a strange familiarity and appreciation of some of our nation's founding documents around exactly who we are and what we're trying to accomplish in the creation of what became the United States. Now, they had a very particular bent of manifest destiny, and that's the lens through which we read these primary documents. Nevertheless, primary documents they were. When I was introduced to the work of Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and others who are, considered the architects of critical race theory, it absolutely made sense to me because I had been familiar with these other longstanding discourses in the United States that had a history way back to Plymouth Plantation with the separatists in New England, through John Winthrop's City on a Hill, to manifestations that appeared to counter the Carter administration, and sort of this long history of the ascent of an organized religious right in the United States. Um, Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and other critical race theorists are lawyers, and when they explain critical race theory, they're not explaining this high and lofty um, metaphysics or cosmology of the world. They're talking about the very real effects of our legal structures, where they came from, why they were created, and to what ends they were created, right? So um, I had already learned about the Whiskey Rebellion, for example, which took place after the Revolutionary War in the United States. And when I learned about, oh wow, there were all these farmers and low country people who were veterans of the American Revolution, and for all intents and purposes, these were founding fathers of the United States. They were upset that the federal government was taxing them without representation.
Right.
And they were upset that they were not allowed to sell their wares, just like the gentlemen settlers who signed the Constitution did. Um, and we saw through the primary sources in literature at the time that the fear that the United States had was that free slaves and Indians would join with these poor whites, and that they would turn the tide of hegemonic power that existed in the colonies at the time, or rather the burgeoning nation of the United States at the time.
Right.
And critical race theory points to episodes like this, and they say, look, like if you just read the laws that are created federally in response to these things, we can see that there's an effective wedge that's driven between free blacks, between poor unlanded tenant farmers who were white, and this sort of forever divided, legally speaking, any any real means of joining across that racial divide to upset the hegemony on the frontier. And it's amazing that the critics today who look at there's many more examples I could give, but that's one that stands out. The critics today kind of latch onto that, and they just they're not reading these people, they're not interested in reading these people, but they are interested in activating certain social groups and powerful interests to do exactly what critical race theory is pointing out. They are denying cross-racial lobbying efforts and organizing efforts in a way that solidifies power around a particular class of people. And that particular class is not just wealth, it is racial first and foremost. And when we look at the histories of the United States, it's absolutely undeniable. So when we bring this into the study of religion, right, to bring it home finally, we have to bring that into conversation, right? Like we cannot shy away from these overlapping realities that so define not only the way that we produce knowledge, but the questions that we ask, right? And I think that that's where critical race theory can be very helpful.
Really well said. Thank you. Yeah, that's great example, great connection with religious studies. And I think more and more, one of the things I've noticed in the field of religion ecology, just broadly conceived, is more people engaging with critical theory, critical race studies. And it seems like it's kind of a missing piece of the puzzle for a lot of this discourse,
Mm,
especially insofar as we want to make positive change in the world. Like
mm,
ultimately, that's going to have to engage with racial differences, gender, class, ability, that just a whole broad spectrum of intersectionality.
mhm.
So yeah, really appreciate you bringing that voice into the mix. And and part of this then would be that we could criticize the very formation of the category of religion, right?
Mm,
That critical theory is also going to say, well, you might want to look at what exactly was happening when people started labeling some kinds of
exactly.
social or cultural formations as religions, and then some things aren't religions. And
Mhm,
so, especially, I think with the study of indigenous traditions, then people really wonder, is the application of the term religion here helpful? Is
mhm.
it more of a hindrance? Is it something we should be criticizing? So I'm wondering if you could shed a little bit of light on that, the very idea of religion.
Sure. And I think this again gets to um, why it's so imperative to talk about colonization and race and wealth when we talk about ecology, right? Because those are material things, right? Like these are real things in the world that and as students of ecology, we know that these things affect one another, right? They are connected in an ecology, right? In a habitat. So it's impossible to isolate one as if it has no impact with and upon the others, right? In this matrix of or this ecological matrix that constitutes these things, right? Um, when I think about like critical theory and some of its positive contributions in deconstructing our categories of religion, I really want to stress the reality of what's happening on the ground. Because when we talk about theory, again, we buy into that liberal humanist binary between spirit and matter, right? Between knowledge and between those boots on the ground and extractive economies and these very real dynamics that are contributing to ecological disaster, right? Um, so, right as you mentioned, there's a couple of long-standing conversations that are happening around the dynamics that you're calling attention to. One, there is a very contentious relationship, legally speaking, between the freedom of religion exercised by Native American peoples in what is now the United States versus everyone else, right?
Yeah.
They are uniquely at risk. They are uniquely judged against when it comes to the percentage of court cases. This also has everything to do with religion, from the John Marshall trilogy, which coincided with the Indian Removal Acts, um, in which the Supreme Court Chief Justice of the United States explicitly drew upon the doctrines of discovery to justify the removal of the so-called five civilized tribes from the southeastern part of the United States, so that white wealthy planters, including Andrew Jackson, could move into the South along with thousands and thousands of enslaved Africans. Um, these are material circumstances. These are material effects that are happening that are ecological, right? These significantly affect the balance of power and economy in the world. It creates supply, it creates demand, it creates labor, and dehumanizes everyone in the process. We have to talk about these things when we look at ecological and or religious investigations. I think it's also fascinating to call attention to some insights from the critical turn in religion, which calls into question these categories that we have just inherited and sometimes don't, hold accountable. I have to be honest, I had not really encountered or engaged much with critical religion until just recently in the last couple of years. And I've noticed that some people tend to read them like very unfairly. Um, and we could say that of both sides of debates in religion, but I do want to reaffirm that one of the things that I think is very important as an insight from critical religion is that this category, legally speaking, has teeth and it has effects. Um, and in some ways, they've been criticized as being non-real, of saying that if religion is just a made-up category, and if it's just a social construction, then it's a figment of our imagination, and it doesn't really have any effects in the world. I think that this is, that's a completely asinine argument to make. Um, if one appreciates the category of religion as a construct, just like race is a construct, um, that is not to deny that it has very real effects in the world. And one of the effects of categorizing religion in the way that we do in the United States disproportionately affects natives. More than that, there have been fantastic pieces of scholarship from folks like Timothy Fitzgerald, who have shown a continuation of a legal and religious and political discourse on savagery and civility that has underpinned this discourse in the English language. And it's fascinating that when one looks at the ways that empire and extractive economies went global around the world at the same time that Africans were being also extracted from Africa and imported in the United States en masse. When these world-shifting and world-changing events were occurring, there were legal structures in place that protected it and that allowed it to happen. And one of these tropes and discourses and mechanisms is this othering of non-Christian nations and of so-called barbarous or pagan nations as non-human. This is how Great Britain, for example, could legally justify enslaved Africans as legal property, right? In the same way that the United States continued to do the same thing for a very long time. But there's also designations for Native peoples in the United States. And it's fascinating to see how this so-called debate that we see between religion and secularity in popular discourse is really two sides of the same liberal humanist coin. And that if we sort of appreciate that as a construct that is directed in a very particular direction, that is to say, it enables and protects power in a very certain place, then we can see how the continued othering of Native American peoples through our laws about religion undermine their connection to the land, and therefore participates in the ongoing eradication of them from their territory so that it can be taken by the United States. And this isn't conspiracy. This is just, it's a plain fact. That the other day I mentioned in the AAR panel that as recently as 2005, we had Supreme Court justices that are still drawing on the doctrine of discovery to legitimate all Indian law in the United States. This is fascinating for religious scholars and for legal scholars and anyone interested in ecology, because all of this coincides with the inauguration of our world order as it is now.
Yeah, and I think, as somebody living in California in the San Francisco Bay Area, the removal of indigenous people from their land and preventing them from maintaining their traditional fire practices is precisely one of the main causes, along with climate change, of the severity of these fires. So, I mean, when the air pollution is filling my lungs, I feel the very material effects of the way that these religious and ecological ideas have been negotiated for the last, few hundred years. So yeah, I, appreciate it, more physically than I have in the past, for sure. And to me, this is the perspective we need to hear a lot more of.
There's a fascinating field of study for anyone interested in ecology looking at traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, or indigenous knowledge practices. Part of my research looks at science and technology studies and indigenous science and technology studies. And there's a fantastic and burgeoning field of science that's coming from native ethnographers, native geographers, native scientists, all across the board, who are using their traditional knowledges and their traditional practices alongside empirical research. And it's amazing to see their insights and to draw upon different ways of constructing knowledge in the world, and in the community relations that result because of them. Indigenous knowledges suggest that those productions of knowledge are reciprocal, and those things happen all the time. Whereas over here, in a liberal humanist land, we tend to see it driven by agents and actors and drivers. And part of my research is to deconstruct some of those notions of the liberal human as kind of divorced from this long legacy of colonialism and of racialized imperialism, and to maybe look in other directions, not to extract knowledges, but to hold our knowledge systems accountable.
Nice. Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah, and I appreciate the reference to TEK. That's so important. And yeah, more and more stuff coming out about that that's very accessible. I think of like Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass,
Yeah.
right? Really introducing these ideas to a very broad audience. So I don't know, I find that very exciting. And I want to talk for a while more about it, but we should probably go. So for one last thing, it'd be great to hear a little bit kind of a plug for what you're working on in the future. I know that you're co-editing a special issue of the journal Politics. So if you could just say a little bit about that so people can kind of keep an eye out for this issue.
Cool, thanks. Yes, I was very fortunate. One of the things that I love the best about Twitter is the relationships that it fosters with people. This opportunity came through Twitter. Some senior scholars and some junior scholars. I'm one of 4 people who are co-editing this journal. We got together on Twitter and we started talking about, hey, is there anyone else that's looking at climate change and race? And we started talking about the need for a bigger conversation, since so many different people were talking about these things, but in different fields and departments. Yes, with the International Journal Politics, alongside Lisa Tilly and Andrew Baldwin and Adamupama Ranawana, I will be a co-editor for a special issue that looks at sort of the impact that climate change has on particular racialized peoples as they are searching and push to find water, new places to live, mass migrations. When we talk about climate change, we tend to talk about sort of these atmospheric, almost abstract, universal concepts, while acknowledging that it's going to have real impact on the ground. But looking at people and looking at including non-human animals as well, in the ways that we are all participating in and being affected by climate change is also a very important thing to look at. And so what we're trying to do in this journal is lift up those voices of people all over the world as they're researching the effects of climate change on these very vulnerable populations, including indigenous peoples.
Nice. That's exciting. I'm really looking forward to that. Will that be out in 2021, you think?
I'm hoping it'll be out in 2021, of course, but the pandemic, things have been slow, understandably so. We're waiting on a couple of more, but it looks like it'll be in spring or summer of 2021.
Very cool. I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for that. And I'll have to have you back on really when that's coming out, because I still have a lot more I want to talk to you about. So, Tyler Tully, thanks for being on. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody else for tuning in. We'll be back next week with some more religion and ecology information for you. And in the meantime, take care and be well.